Hi there, and welcome to a short video that's going to look at short-run business costs with a focus for Theme 3 Microeconomics. So we're going to talk about the short run for a business, and in economics we do tend to make an artificial distinction between the short run and the long run. In the short run we assume that at least one factor input is fixed. If you're a farmer, for example, you could have a given amount of land and capital equipment. If you're a bakery, you could have a given size of bakery and capital inputs to put in there. And you can vary your production by adding more variable inputs into the production process. So in the short term, businesses are said to be constrained with fixed and variable factors. Hence, they have fixed and variable costs. However, in the long term, all factors of production are assumed to be variable, and the business can change the entire scale of production, hopefully benefiting from economies of scale. Fixed costs are costs that do not depend directly on the level of output produced. They have to be paid, for example, even if output is stopped or is zero. So consulting fees, if you employ a consultant to research your business and things, that could be a fixed fee, doesn't depend on output. You could have a coffee shop where the annual rent doesn't depend on how many customers come into your shop. Rental costs are essentially fixed in that sense. Spending on marketing and advertising, a lot of that is fixed, doesn't depend on sales. Research and development, for example in pharmaceuticals, can be treated as a fixed cost, and oftentimes some of your labour costs are fixed if you're employing people on permanent contracts, paying them a salary where their pay does not depend on output. Things like business insurance. Yes, insurance premiums can go up and down, but they don't depend on output. On the other hand, variable costs do depend on how much you're producing in the short term. So you might be paying workers according to their commission, pay them a productivity bonus, for example. You might be employing people on an hourly wage, so that's a variable cost. The component parts used in production, the raw materials, the inputs used in production will be a variable cost. Any basic raw material or ingredient, the cost of energy and fuel, and also, for example, packaging, logistics, getting the product to the consumer. So those will be variable costs. What I thought I'd do in this video is take you through just a simple numerical example of fixed and variable costs. There's going to be no diagrams, no charts, just let's work through together a table showing variable and fixed costs, and then give you a chance to do some calculations if you want to test your understanding. So here's our worked example. Let's take maybe a case of a bakery that's producing loaves per week, and conceivably they could produce up to 4,500 per week, but they have fixed and they have variable costs. So notice here in the column 2 that the fixed cost of production are at £300. So even if they didn't produce any loaves every week, they would still have to pay the fixed costs. But of course, the more they produce, the fixed cost per unit must go down. Let's add in some variable costs, and here they are. Now these are the costs associated with producing more loaves per week, and I've put the numbers in to make a particular point. They're not necessarily realistic, but notice here that initially they rise quite slowly, but then later on they rise quickly, suggesting the bakery is perhaps coming up against some sort of capacity constraint. Their costs are rising quite sharply. So 3 columns left blank, while total cost is fixed plus variable cost. We just add those 2 costs together and we get those numbers. Produce 500 units per week, your total cost will be £500. If you double up to 1,000, your total costs rise to only 650, and so on and so forth. Now, marginal cost. Marginal cost is the change in total cost, the change in column 4, resulting from a 1 unit change in production. Change in total cost if we increase output by 1 unit. Notice in column 1 here that output is going up in blocks of 500. So we'd probably have to divide by 500 to get that 1 unit change. If you want to do a calculation here, if you want to have a go, just press the pause button and press play when you want to check through the answers and the explanation with me. So what about marginal cost? Marginal cost, here are the numbers expressed in, if you like, pence per loaf. So for example, the marginal cost of the first 500 is 40p per loaf, because if we didn't produce any loaves, cost would be 300. If we go to 500 loaves per week, our costs rise to 500. So they've gone up by £200, and therefore 40p per loaf. The next batch of 500 only adds £150 to cost. So the marginal cost for that next batch, if you like, comes down to 30p per loaf. And similarly, the next batch, taking us up to 1500, only adds £100 to cost. So those extra 500 loaves only cost us 20p each, and so on and so forth. Indeed, marginal cost is minimised when we go from 1500 output to 2000. You can see here that the total cost only rises from 750 to 800. So it's gone up by 50. So that's only 10p per extra loaf. Thereafter, notice in column 5 here that marginal cost starts to go up. And this is a reflection of what's called the law of diminishing returns. Something's happening to the production process, which is making the marginal cost of a loaf higher, not lower. Indeed, by the end, it's costing more than £2 per extra loaf. So that's clearly going to have an impact on the cost of the business per unit across all units. The final column, if you want to have a go, is average cost. Average cost is simply total cost, column 4, divided by output per week, column 1. If you want to have a go at calculating the cost per unit for different ranges of output then. Okay, so average cost, here are the numbers. So it's total cost over output, and you see here the average cost is falling initially from £1 to 65p to 50, down to 40, and then it stays the same at 40p per unit before rising again. The crucial thing here is to think about the relationship, the key mathematical relationship between marginal and average cost. So, for example, if we increase our output from 500 to 1,000, the marginal cost is only 30p. The previous average was £1 per loaf, but because the marginal is less than the average, then the average must fall, and it does fall quite sharply from £1 to 65p. That's helped by the fact that the fixed cost per unit must be falling as well. Again, go forward to the next unit. The marginal cost is 20p, lower than previous average 65, so the average must fall, it falls to 50, and so on. Notice here that providing the marginal is low and less than the average, then the average must fall. But down the middle, when we go from 2,000 to 2,500, the marginal cost is 40p. The previous average was 40p. So if the marginal is equal to the average, then the average stays the same, doesn't it? Stays at 40p. Thereafter, choose one bit further down, marginal cost is now rising quite sharply, £1.20. The previous average was 43p, and so that is now going to drag the average cost per unit up because the marginal cost of those extra units is quite high. That's causing the cost per unit to increase. Now, we're not going to draw the curves here. Oftentimes you'll do this in lessons anyway. The key thing to go through this video is this relationship between the marginal cost of production and the average cost of production. If you can smash that, you're in great shape for understanding cost. I'm just going to look at two other costs. Average variable cost on column 5 here is the variable cost divided by output. We take column 3 and divide by column 1. If we do that, you see that initially the variable cost per unit does fall. That's because marginal cost is falling. But then average variable cost starts to rise, rising from a low of 25p to heading up towards £1 per loaf. So average variable cost is quite similar to the behaviour of marginal cost. It falls, then rises. It falls, then it rises. But what about average fixed cost? Well, hopefully you've got this one. The total fixed cost, if you look at column 2 here, the total fixed costs are the same, but output is going up. So fixed cost per unit of output must be falling. And if I do the maths here, you can see that if you've got 500, average fixed cost should be less than that. So the fixed costs per unit must be falling. So falling from 30p down to 20, 15, 12, and so on. There's actually a little mistake there. When output's 500, the fixed cost must be 60p, not £1, because it's 300 divided by 500. Apologies for that. But notice here that the fixed cost per unit must be falling and will continue to fall. Although notice here that the fixed cost per unit is falling at a decreasing rate because you're spreading those overheads, £300, across a much bigger range of output. Okay, fixed cost per unit must always fall. So the key takeaway points, if you've been with us on this video, the key takeaway points on short run costs are as follows. Fixed cost per unit will always fall as output increases in the short run. Variable costs are essentially driven by marginal cost of production. The average total cost, the average cost per unit, will always fall if the marginal cost is less than the average. But the average cost per unit will always be going up if the marginal cost is greater than the average. Thank you.